Miracles and Magic. The ritual of him who has seen the Shah, or truth, is above anger and kindness, infidelity and religion. Mathnavi 4. A writer named Abdul Hadi recorded 6 centuries ago that his father told him one day, "You were born as a result of a prayer by the great Bahuddin Naqshband of Bokhara, whose miracles are innumerable." He conceived as a result of this statement such a desire to see this Sufi master that as soon as he was able to detach himself from his affairs, he travelled from Syria to Central Asia. He found Bahuddin, died 1389, the head of the Naqshbandi order, sitting surrounded by disciples, and told him that he had had to come to him because he was curious about his miracles. Bahuddin said, "There is a food other than ordinary food. This is the food of impressions, naqsha, which are penetrating into man ceaselessly from many directions of his environment. Only the elect know what these impressions are and can direct them. Do you understand?" Abdul Hadi did not see the connection and remained silent. The meaning of this is one of the secrets of the Sufis. The master makes the food, which is a different nutriment, available to the aspirant, and this aids his development. This is outside the laws of happening which can be understood. Now as to what you call miracles. Everyone present here has seen miracles. What is important is the function of miracles. Miracles may be destined to supply a part of the food which is an extra food, and may act upon the mind and even the body in a certain way. When this happens, the experience of the miracle will perform its due and proper function on the mind. If the miracle acts only on the imagination, as with the crude mind, it will stimulate uncritical credulity or emotional excitement, or a thirst for more miracles, or a desire to understand miracles, or a one-sided attachment to, even fear of, the person who is apparently responsible for the miracle. This, he continued, made the miracle something which could not be explained satisfactorily because of the many different trains of thought which it prompted, different in every mind, and the many chains of effect it caused, different in everybody. There was nobody, except for the mature Sufi, who could recognize the true interpretation of a miracle. This applied with an inexplicable miracle. How much more did it apply to a miracle which happened, but which was not palpable? There were miracles in continuous operation which humanity did not perceive through the senses, because they were undramatic. An example was a process whereby, against all probability, a man might gain or lose moral or material things in a frequent succession. Sometimes these are called coincidences. All miracles were in fact coincidences, a series of things happening in a certain relationship to one another. Miracles, said Naqshband, have a function, and that function operates whether they are understood or not. They have a true objective function. Hence, miracles in some people produce confusion, in others skepticism, in others fear, in others excitement, and so on. It is the function of the miracle to provoke reactions and supply nutriment. Nutriment in this case which varies with the personality acted upon. In all cases, the miracle is an instrument of both influence and assessment of the people acted upon. All miracles, according to the Sufis, have thus such a multifarious action on humanity that they cannot be a. performed except when needed, and generally develop as incidental happenings, b. diagnosed or defined because of the complexity of their nature. The nature of a miracle cannot be detached from its effect, because it would not be of any importance if a human being were not involved. A typical statement of a miracle attributed to what might be called a short-term requirement is contained in a vast collection of materials referring to Abdul Qadir of Jilan, the founder of the Qadiri order of Sufis. Sheikh Amru Osman Sairifini and Sheikh Abdul Haq Harini deposed as follows. On the third day of the month of Safar, in the year 555 of the flight, we were in the presence of our master, Syed Abdul Qadir, in his school. He rose and put on wooden sandals and performed an ablution. Then he performed 2 prayers and gave a loud shout, throwing one sandal into the air, when it seemed to disappear. With a further cry, the master threw the second sandal into the air, and this also vanished from our sight. None of those who were present dared to question him about the event. 30 days after this incident, a caravan arrived in Baghdad from the east. Its members said they had some gifts for the master. We consulted him, and he allowed us to accept the presents. The members of the caravan gave us some silken and some other cloth, and a pair of sandals which were the same ones which the master had held from him. Their account was as follows. On the third day of the month of Safar, that day being a Sunday, we were on the road with our caravan when there was a sudden Arab attack under 2 chiefs. The robbers killed some of our number and plundered the caravan. They immediately entered a nearby forest for the purpose of distributing the loot. We survivors reassembled at the edge of the forest. It occurred to us that we could invoke the aid of the Syed in our calamity, for we had no recourse and no means wherewith to continue our journey. We resolved to offer him presents in token of thanksgiving, should we at least arrive safely in Baghdad, an improbability as the situation then seemed to be. As soon as we had made this decision, we were alarmed by one, and then another, cry which echoed through the glades. We concluded that the first band of Arabs had been attacked by a second one, and that a fight between them would now follow. Soon afterward, a party from the bandits came to us and said there had been a disaster. They begged us to accept our property back. We proceeded to the place at which our merchandise had been collected by the Arabs, and found that their 2 captains were lying dead, each with a wooden sandal near his head. It appears to us indubitable that the master, having perceived the calamity of the caravaneers, moved by a desire to aid them, had been able to project his sandals in such a way that the leaders of the band, the ultimately guilty parties, were killed. Preserved by us as a matter of record and committed to writing in the presence of Almighty God, the distinguisher and requiter of truth and falsehood. The Naqshbandi tradition referring to such events as these has it that, when a friend perceives that a wrong is to be righted, he will seek guidance as to the method and permission as to the propriety in a state of contemplation, when the necessary effect will follow instantly and continuously, or subsequently and appropriately. Miracles, says Afghani, may make you feel conviction about a thing. Be sure that whatever they make you feel, this is not their actual effect, nor the end of their effect. This functional attitude toward miracles underlines, even for the outside observer, deeper possibilities of inexplicable happenings. If we start from the lowest level of miracles, we can see that an action or happening which is familiar and explicable to us might be puzzling or conclusive magical evidence to a more ignorant person. Hence, a savage, seeing fire made by chemical means, might consider the happening miraculous. At his stage of development, this event might produce in him the degree of religious awe necessary to make him venerate the performer or obey his injunctions. In any case, there would be a mental and physical effect upon him. At the other end of the scale, happenings which cannot be explained by current physical science will influence even the most sophisticated modern. In the case of the invisible miracles referred to by Naqshband, a similar mechanism would be operative. A long succession of coincidental and favourable or unfavourable happenings involving a human being will be certain to exert over him a mental and physical effect, even if the latter is only that he will eat more than usual because he can afford to do so through his run of luck. This theory goes much further than ordinary thinking about miracles, and differs from the usual reactions only insofar as it insists that nothing is truly accidental or isolated. This is underlined by the Sufi teaching that effect is far more important than cause, because effect is varied, while cause is ultimately only one. Even the most hardened materialist would agree with this, if it were put into his own phraseology, something like this: all action is ultimately physical action, and the differences in its effect are determined by what is being acted upon. No Sufi would quarrel with this, apart from saying that the pure materialist is capable of only a limited view of origins and causation, seeing them in a one- or two-dimensional way because of the rigidity of his outlook. Miracles are connected with causation problems, and causation, according to the Sufi, with the problems of space and time. Many miracles are considered such because they seem to defy the conventions of space or time or both. A breakthrough into an extra dimension would rob them of their inexplicable quality. But, say the Sufis, since miracles have physical effects, it is the effect of the miracle which may generally be a part of the food which is not a food, which can be significant. It is only on a crude level that an investigation into miracles can be attempted. A miracle is therefore accepted calmly in Sufi perspective as the working of a mechanism which will influence a man or woman to the extent to which he is attuned with it. A crazed savage who wants to immerse himself in the overwhelming emoting of apparent miraculousness is not a candidate for spiritual development, though he may make a very much improved and law-abiding member of a conventionally religious society as a result of his experience. My own teacher once commented on a question about miracles by saying, "Contemplate the phrase, 'Why is the sound of an onion?' to show that some questions cannot be put by those who have not the capacity to pose them, nor, consequently, the potentiality of understanding the real answer." The evidential miracle as interpreted in conventional religion may be of multiple value, according to the Sufis. That is to say, it may convey one impression to a man at one stage of development, and a form of food to someone more advanced. We can be even more specific. Professor Seligman was surprised to find that incisions made by certain dervishes in the flesh stopped bleeding with inexplicable rapidity. Other observers have noted that Rifai dervishes can cause wounds which seem to heal without any scar, and with absurd rapidity. Until Dr. Hunt in 1931 showed a film of Indian Rifais performing these practices, the ordinary reaction had been to discount the whole thing, or else to attribute it to hypnotism. The Qadiri dervishes are seen walking upon water. The Azimia are reputed to appear, like many of the ancient sheikhs, at different places at one and the same time. Why do these things happen, or seem to happen? The dervish has a completely different attitude toward them than the ordinary man, whether he be a credulous simpleton or a 20th century scientist. It must be remembered that the Sufi claims that things are not what they seem. In demonstrating his ability to do things that others cannot do, which appear contrary to accepted physical laws familiar to everyone, he states his case. This is as valid a method of expressing oneself as any literary form, and more effective than most. The fact that this form of statement has been abused, misunderstood, and counterfeited does not invalidate the basis of it. The outside observer, especially if he is what is generally considered to be objective or educated, is heavily hampered when approaching this problem. His pressing need is to explain the phenomena in terms understood by him. He has no sense of a duty to extend his own perceptions into the phenomena which he is investigating. Yet from the dervish point of view, this man is getting only such nutrition as he allows himself to get out of the miracle. When a child is afraid of a bogey, he must find an explanation, or have a plausible one found for him. When an insensitive man looks at inexplicable happenings and knows that there must be a logical explanation, this explanation will be supplied to him. I do not say how or by whom. In Sufism, the secret protects itself. Hallucinations, as they are called, work both ways, according to Sufi experience. A man may think that he sees something which is not in fact there. He may also see something other than what is really there. How he sees it and what he sees will depend upon his own capacity of understanding. I am not now talking about deliberate deceit and conjuring tricks. To assume, just because a thing can be explained in rational terms, that this is the only explanation for it, is not an absurdity in ordinary experience. But it is incorrect if one is living on a level where several different explanations are actually seen to be possible, in accordance with the quality of the percipient to profit by them. Modern science has not yet acquired this special refinement of differentiation. Its dimensions are not sufficient for the purpose. A traditional Sufi method of referring to this situation is to use an analogy. Sufis, also traditionally, use analogies familiar to the people whom they are addressing. Western readers of this book will all know the story of Hans Christian Andersen, generally called The Tale of the Ugly Duckling. The duckling thought that it was ugly, and so it was, seen from the point of view of the ducks. All ended well, because it was discovered that he was a swan. The germ of this story is to be found in Jalaluddin Rumi's Mathnavi, where a point is stressed which has been lost in the Danish version, aimed at a different audience. Rumi tells his hearers that they are ducks being brought up by hens. They have to realize that their destiny is to swim, not to try to be chickens. While the subject of magic and miracles is looked at from a chicken standpoint by a duckling, his opinions, to say the least, are likely to be inaccurate. The Scandinavian fabulist gave the story an encouraging flavour. The duckling became a swan by the inevitable process of growing up. Rumi, always an evolutionist, points out that the chick must realize that it is destined to become a duck. Miracles are now seen as a part of the development pattern of human life. This attitude removes them from the preoccupation of the theologian, who seeks to justify them on the lower level, and from the skeptic, who seeks to explain them in terms of scientific theory. They have a significant function of their own. In communities where the age of miracles is past, the miracle phenomenon therefore continues to operate. One might say that, although the volcano is no longer a dragon belching fire, it is still in existence as a volcano. Retaining our metaphor, we can now descry a sense of process in physical phenomena, though the symbolism may change. The Turkish secret society in Cyprus, dedicated to unifying and projecting the dynamic of a community in its evolution, was known as volcano, thus neatly translating the feeling of inner or underground force from the physical, transplanted from seemingly independent nature force to the human community. This approach to miracles means that, however attractive a recital of wonders performed by anyone may be, such a rehearsal will not have the same function as the actual event which is being reported. This is the explanation of the Sufi teaching, "Let the miracle act," reflected in part by the Spanish proverb, "Hágase el milagro aunque lo haga Mahoma." Let the miracle be done, even though Muhammad does it. A degeneration of this sense is the doctrine, "the end justifies the means." The Sufis, however, do not lose sight of the attendant belief that, if the seeming miracle is of importance in the development of a group, in this case the Sufis, it is more likely to occur in a progressing group, in order to make the progress of the group faster or more solid. The miracle, says Kamaluddin, is a foretaste of the power of the group, which is developing organs capable of attaining miracles. Two things are developing simultaneously: the right attitude toward miracles and the harmonious yoking of the seeker with the miracle factor. Again, looking at the question in an evolutionary light, it might be said that the man who is lost in crude wonder at the marvels of a motor car, a miracle of a thing, will be slow to step into his proper function, which is to use that car or to be transported by it. This limiting effect of the sense of wonderment is the reason why Sufi teachers have spoken against indulgence in the ecstatic experience, which is only a stage in the development of the Sufi. Lost in awe and wonderment, the Sufi seeker is halted when he should be going forward to the realization beyond. The seeking of temporary or even permanent mystical experience is therefore spoken of as a veil. True reality is held to be beyond ecstasy, as Kalabadi of Bokhara says in his Kitab el-Taruf. Junaid of Baghdad, died 910, one of the first classical authors, says that in ecstasy man is delighted, but when truth comes, it takes ecstasy's place. He mentions passing through the standard Sufi experience of ecstasy, followed by unawareness of ecstasy. A man pestered the teacher Nureddin for information about magical powers, healing gifts, and inner satisfaction through the Sufi way. Nureddin said, "You are prowling around our campfire, brother. Shed wolfish acquisitiveness and sup with us, not upon us. You are in the wrong order of thinking. One thing must come before another." The visitor said, "Then give me some impressions of you and your friends, that I may decide whether to make common cause with you." The teacher said, "If you measure us against your present ideas, you will be looking through a cloudy glass at the sun. This will make you represent us in relation to your present ideas and those of your friends or enemies. If you collect odd facts about us, your collecting will be determined by a method of selection different from the method used in making a posy like ours. Unfortunately for the final aim, the posy may look good, but it will not provide the scent which you need." While there is no need to consider honest scholars as wolves prowling around the Sufi campfire, the bafflement inseparable from trying to study something which is interior change through external methods remains, and is often expressed: who were the adepts to whom he, Ghazali, did communicate these thrilling secrets? Was there really anything to communicate? If so, what? Gardner, Introduction to the Niche for Lights, page 6. Lane mentions the regret which a converted Muslim felt at having to abandon these religious exercises. It is interesting to note that this particular man said that as a dervish he had developed unusual telepathic power, so that he knew what was going on at a distance and could even hear words that were spoken there. Claims to such power are commonplace in Sufi literature. Certainly stories one has heard from people of unimpeachable veracity confirm the existence of very remarkable powers, whatever the explanation may be. The theologian Professor A. Guillaume, Islam, London, 1954, page 152. Speaking of Najmuddin Kubra, died 1221, precursor of Francis of Assisi, the Reverend John Subhan provides a sample of the unusual endowments of Sufi sheikhs. The influence of this founder of the Great Brethren, Ikhwan Kubrawiya, was not limited to human beings, but extended to birds and animals. Phenomena of a very similar kind to this are exhibited even today. Standing at the door of his khanaqah, his glance fell upon a passing dog. Instantly the condition of the dog was changed, and it showed such behavior as to correspond to that of a man who had lost himself, i.e. in the mystic sense. Wherever it went, dogs gathered round it, and would put their paws in his, a token of allegiance, and then withdraw themselves and stand at a respectful distance surrounding it. Sufism, Its Saints and Shrines, Lucknow, 1938, pages 182-83. In the seesaw of magical belief and literature from ancient times to the Middle Ages, and then again until today, certain features of magical practice are important sophistically. Magic surrounds Eastern symbolism in a way which has not yet been understood outside, and the way in which it is understood within Sufi groups is not generally available beyond their walls. Alchemy is known to be of allegorical as well as literal usage. Magical literature veils a good deal of Sufic material. Exactly how it is used and what the allegories are cannot be conveyed satisfactorily. But sir and sir al-halal, permitted magic, according to Islamic legal definition, covers Sufi material, part of which is inaccessible elsewhere in written form. Fragments are found in Jawahir-i Kamsa, 5 jewels, and is religio-magical. Magic then, in this usage, the vehicle for the transmission of allegorical teaching. Sufism has used the permitted terminology of magic, as of alchemy, philosophy, science, to convey Sufic material. This technique of using the terms of one discipline to represent another was brought to the West fairly early. As Professor Guillaume notes, the Illuminist Sufi Ibn Masara of Cordoba, for instance, was the first to introduce into the West an intentionally ambiguous and obscure use of common words, and his example has been followed by most subsequent esoteric writers. Opere Citate, page 266. 5 Jewels itself is derived in part from the magical books of El-Buni, the Western magician of the Arabs, and the whole high magical tradition of medieval Europe is strongly influenced by literal adaptations of the Spanish Arab schools, whose work includes magical documents. One of the reasons for adopting the magical cover was the well-established survival value of magical texts, one of whose characteristics is that no word shall be altered. It may therefore be accepted, as personal investigation has showed, that much of the Sufic lore which would not pass muster in a theological guise was transmitted in a magical one. Magic is a training system as much as it is anything else. It may be based upon experience, upon tradition of celestial or other ascription, upon religion. Magic not only assumes that it is possible to cause certain effects by means of certain techniques, it also schools the individual in those techniques. Magic, as we know it today, may be subject to every form of rationalization. It embodies, taken as a whole corpus of collected material, minor processes such as small hypnotic techniques, and beliefs which attempt to duplicate natural happenings. While Sufism cannot be taken apart to see what its constituents are, the magical tradition, because it is a truly composite one, can in fact be so dissected. We are only concerned with that part, a very large part, of magic which is involved in the effort to produce new perceptions and to develop new organs of human development. Looked at in this light, a great part of the human heritage of magical practice, which often includes religious practices, is seen to have been concerned with this quest. Magic is not so much based upon assumptions that things can be done which transcend the normal man's capabilities, as upon the intuitive feeling that, if you like, faith can move mountains. Those magical activities which are designed to exercise the projection of thought or ideas at a distance, or to see the future, or to attain a contact with the source of superior knowledge, all carry their echo of a dim human consciousness that there is a possibility of man's taking part consciously in the work of evolution, and the feeling of a stirring, evolving organ of perception beyond those senses which are formally recognized by physical science as it stands today. Magic, then, to the Sufi, is judged according to Sufic criteria. Is it involved in the development of man? If it is, where does it stand in relation to the main Sufi stream? Magic is seen, sophistically, as generally a deterioration of a Sufic system. The methodology and repute of the system continues, but the essential contact with the continuing destiny of the system is lost. The magician who seeks to develop powers in order to profit by certain extra-physical forces is following a fragment of a system. Because of this, the warnings against the terrible dangers in magical dabbling or obsession are frequent, almost invariable. It is too often assumed that the practitioners imposed a ban on casual magic because they wanted to preserve a monopoly. From the long-term viewpoint, it is far more evident that the practitioners themselves have an imperfect knowledge of the whole of the phenomenon, some of whose parts they use. The terrible dangers of electricity are not dangers at all to the man who works continuously with electricity and has a good technical knowledge. Magic is worked through the heightening of emotion. No magical phenomena take place in the cool atmosphere of the laboratory. When the emotion is heightened to a certain extent, a spark, as it were, jumps the gap, and what appear to be supernormal happenings are experienced. Familiar as an example to most people are poltergeist phenomena. They occur only where there are adolescents or others in a state of relatively continuous nervous emotional tension. They hurl stones, seem to cancel the force of gravity, move tremendously heavy objects. When the magician is trying, shall we say, to move a person or an object, or influence a mind in a certain direction, he has to go through a procedure, more or less complicated, more or less lengthy, to arouse and concentrate emotional force. Because certain emotions are more easily roused than others, magic tends to center around personal power, love, and hatred. It is these sensations in the undeveloped individual which provide the easiest fuel, emotion, electricity for the spark to jump the gap, which will leap to join a more continuous current. When the present-day followers of the witchcraft tradition in Europe speak of their perambulation of a circle, seeking to raise a cone of power, they are following this part of the magical tradition. But the seer, who places himself into a certain state in order to penetrate beyond the time barrier, and the magician, who undergoes a course of training in order to attain a specific object, differ from the Sufi. The Sufi's task is to so organize himself as to make it possible for the meaningful operation of an organ of perception and action which will have a continuing effect. The seer and the magician, like many of the Christian mystics, are not wholly regenerated or reconstituted by the process. The yogi is altered but not made any more meaningful. The Buddhist contemplative may have attained what he was striving for, but this has no connotation of usefulness or dynamism in the sense of activity, particularly for the community. Everyone should read Miss Underhill's book, Mysticism, and almost anyone who is interested in mysticism will generally be found to have done so. She points out a similarity of thinking between the religious and the magical, between the mystic and the magus. To the Sufi, this similarity is in the end contained in the concept of forward-reaching. This is the origin of the human movement toward, among other things, civilization, toward progress, toward more knowledge. Miss Underhill considers that the mystic wants to be, and the magically minded wants to know. The Sufi attitude is undoubtedly that of being, but unlike the familiar type of mystic, he will use knowing as well. He distinguishes between the ordinary knowing of facts and the inner knowing of reality. His activity connects and balances all these factors: understanding, being, knowing. Sufi methodology, too, organizes the emotional force, which the magician tries to explode, into a correctly running fuel for operating the mechanism of being and knowing. Both high magic and ordinary mysticism, viewed in this light, become for the Sufi merely the struggling on of a partial methodology which will simply reproduce its own pattern. Unless it evolves far enough to enable it to reproduce more than it inherited, unless, in fact, there is a genetic amplification of scope and sufficient power of reproduction of that scope, the whole thing is a creaking anachronism. At the best, it is an escape from the destiny of the individual and the community. Are magical-type rituals a part of the genuine tradition of the Sufis? They are not. For the Sufi, certain symbols will have certain associative and certain dynamic functions. These he will use, or be influenced by, instinctively. The ritual is not used by the developed Sufi for the developed Sufis, but it may occur, for the concentrating of the thinking involves an exercise of emotional attachment, and can take place without an equivalent exercise of detachment. Pageantry and ritual as used in non-Sufi life, including processions, regalia, symbolic actions, are viewed by the Sufis as undesirable because they increase the attachment of the attention to something without developing the balancing factor which most people who enjoy traditional pageantry have never even heard of, and obviously often cannot quite grasp if they are simply told about it. Sufi psychology points to an inner mechanism which attempts automatically to balance emotion-causing impacts. This is in operation when people react against something that they have been told, or which the community or any group is trying to implant in their minds. In the modern West, it has given rise to a literary method sometimes known as debunking. The debunker cannot help doing it, for it represents his own need for fulfillment by balance. His public accept it gratefully, because it feeds a hunger caused by emotionality without proper channeling. Intellect does not balance emotion at all, because emotion in this sense is more clearly portrayed as a ballast which has to be correctly distributed, or a burden which has to be well placed, or a force which is being properly used. It is not something which can be suppressed or bypassed by intellect, or which can be inhibited in its expression by thinking, or even which can be properly redirected by exploding it and starting again. When Western psychologists use, say, catharsis to explode emotion or release it, they may apparently fail. If they seem to succeed, they cannot be said to have done more than make the patient more socially acceptable. As far as anyone can tell, he is less troublesome than he was before. This may suit the present phase of society well enough. It is not enough for the Sufi, who considers the human being as something which is going somewhere, not something which is being kept at, or restored to, some sort of norm assessed by purely logical or mainly expedient criteria. All this does not mean that Sufis are not psychologists. On the contrary, their psychosomatic treatment is of such intense importance to the ordinary world that in many places Sufi means physician, and they are, of course, considered magicians in consequence, or mystics. But primarily the Sufi is aiming for something, not working with the halt and the lame as a vocation. Indeed, his psychological and healing, or making whole, abilities come from his primary objective's operation. His knowledge of the imperfections of supposedly sound humanity is the source of his ability to help obviously unsound humanity. Even in public, ordinary traditional mysticism, saints did not become saints because they were healers. They became healers because they were saints, even the greatest of them. This leads back to the question of developed intuition. When the lion is sick, he eats of a certain shrub and cures himself. He does this because the illness has an affinity for a certain plant, or for the essence of it. The cure is always known to the disease. Release this knowledge, and you will know more than the doctor who can only recall facts and memories which seem to apply. There is a difference between hopeful assumptions and positive knowledge, and every case of sickness is slightly different. Tib al-Arif, Medicine of the Gnostic, by Abdul Wali Salik. The Ikhwan el-Safa, faithful friends, generally called in English the Brethren of Sincerity, comprised a secret group which became known through their 52 treatises, published from Basra in about 980 AD. An objective of this school was to make available the whole body of knowledge of the time. Their field covered philosophy, religion, science, and every other branch of learning. They have been accused of being magicians. Like the European Rosicrucians, who may have been influenced by them, they are supposed to have reserved an inner knowledge. The first step toward the realization of this, however, as they saw it, was the establishing of a medium for the dissemination of more ordinary learning. Their individual identity was never established as authors, but their connection with the Sufis is undoubted. Their name, Safa, is assonant with one interpretation of the word Sufi, and the concept of faithfulness in loving friendship is a Sufic one. Their name seems to have been adopted from a group of animals in the collection of allegorical stories called the Khalidar, who by their steadfastness preserved themselves from a hunter. The great master Ghazali shows his debt to them in his Iya, Revival, and among other Sufic teachers, El-Mahri, the predecessor of Omar Khayyam, is known to have attended their meetings. El-Majriti, the astronomer of Madrid, or his disciple El-Kamani of Córdoba, and Averroes took these teachings to the West, including the musical theories which influenced music so profoundly and the moral philosophy which was linked with illumination by the Sufis. The great Rumi advises harmony with the brethren of purity, or sincerity, showing the Sufi character of the mysterious encyclopedists. Think well of the brothers of purity, even though they show harshness toward you. For when evil suspicion takes hold of you, It severs you from 100 friends. If a tender friend treats you roughly to try you, 'tis contrary to reason to distrust him. Winfield's version, Mathnavi, Book 5, Story 10, London 1887. The reference alludes to the Sufi teaching method in which the master may have to test the fortitude of the disciple, or use what seem harsh measures in order to develop bases for Sufic experience. At some time before 1066, El-Majriti, the Madridian, or his disciple El-Karmani of Córdoba, brought the Encyclopedia of the Brethren to Spain from the Near East. Majriti's scientific work was translated by the Englishman Adelard of Bath, Britain's first Arabist and the greatest English scientist before Roger Bacon. Professor P.K. Hitti, History of the Arabs, London 1960, pages 573 and following. Adelard's importance in Western studies is very great indeed, for he provided an early channel for the transmission of Sufic ideas during the classical phase. Studying in both Spain and Syria, he must have come into contact with the Sufi centers in both areas, which were working for the dissemination of book learning plus inner teaching. Because of his outlook, Adelard has been considered a Platonist, though from the Sufi point of view, Platonism is considered a variety of the current later named Sufism. A contemporary medievalist, Gordon Leff, Medieval Thought, London 1958, pages 116 and following, shows how Sufic views were propounded by him as a part of his great contribution to the Centre of Humane Studies and Platonism of the School of Chartres. Adelard's view amounts to making the individual the same as the universal. It is the senses which impede our minds with the individual. He was the first thinker of this period to trace the immediate connection between divine ideas and actual being. This was largely the result of his knowledge of Greek and Arabian science. But the impact of the Brethren was even more startling on other forms of mysticism and transcendental thinking in the West. Since the 11th century, some of the great minds of the East and West have been fascinated by the system known as the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical concept of microcosm and macrocosm, with its theoretical and practical branches. By means of the Kabbalah, man could understand himself, wield incalculable power, perform wonders, do and be almost anything. Eagerly studied and practiced by Jews and Christians alike, the teaching of the Kabbalah was thought to be anchored in the very essence of ancient Hebraic doctrine, the true and ancient teaching which was, in fact, the inner secret doctrine. There is no occult school, no magician, no mystic of the West who is not to some extent influenced by it. The very word is redolent of mystery, of power. What are the origins of the Kabbalah? It is a characteristic of Jewish scholarship that honesty and detachment are wedded to a search for truth. And hence we may not be surprised to find that the Jewish Encyclopedia stresses the determining role of the Brethren of Sincerity on the production of the mighty Kabbalah system. The faithful brothers of Basra originated the 8 elements which form God, it says, changed by a Jewish philosopher in the middle of the 11th century into 10. This alteration of basic Kabbalism deprived the Western development of the system of a great deal of its meaning and usefulness. And Hebrew and Christian Kabbalah literature, later than the 12th century, is therefore only of partial meaning. This includes all aspects of the Kabbalah of 10 elements, as distinct from the 8 Kabbalah. The Kabbalah came from the region of the faithful brothers to 2 places, Italy and Spain. Its system of word manipulation may be derived from parallel and ancient Jewish teaching, but it is founded upon Arabic grammar. There is a most intriguing link between the Sufistic stream and the Jews here. which has caused Sufi teachers to stress the underlying identity of the two. These are some of the facets which link the Sufis and the Judeo-Christian mystics. Ibn Masara of Spain was a precursor of Solomon ibn Gabarol, Avisabron or Avensabrol, who propagated his ideas. These Sufi tenets influenced the development of the Kabbalah more than any other philosophical system, says the Jewish Encyclopedia. And, of course, Ibn Gabarol, the Jewish follower of the Arab Sufi, exercised an immense and widely recognized influence upon Western thought. God is called by the Jewish teacher Azrael in his system of the Kabbalah En Sof, the absolutely infinite, and it was he who undertook to explain the Kabbalah to philosophers after its appearance in Europe. There is no doubt that the Arab study of grammar and the meanings of words is at the base of the usage of words in the Kabbalah for mystical purposes. Arabic grammar was the model for Hebrew grammar. The first Hebrew grammar was written by the Jew Sa'di, died 942, and was, like all the early ones, in Arabic, and entitled Kitab al-Lugha, in Arabic and under the influence of Arabic philology. Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 6, page 69. It was not until the mid-12th century that Hebrew grammar started to be studied by Jews in Hebrew. The Sufis and the Brethren had produced what they considered to be the most ancient teaching, the secret law of fulfillment and power, and handed it to the Arabized Jews. The Jewish Kabbalists adapted this teaching to contemporary Jewish thinking, and the Kabbalah of the Arabs became the Kabbalah of the Jews, and later of the Christians. But the mystical schools of Sufism, which never regarded organized book knowledge as a sufficient source, continued to ally practice of the Sufic rites with the essentials of the old Kabbalah teaching, and it was in this form that mysticism among the Jews was influenced, not primarily through the Jewish Kabbalah. This Sufi tradition is underlined by the Jewish Encyclopedia, which says, "To the spread of Sufism in the 8th century was probably due the revival of Jewish mysticism in Mohammedan countries at that period. Under the direct influence of the Sufis arose the Jewish sect called Yudganites." Volume 9, page 579. The effect of the Sufi system upon the mystical Jewish Merkabah riders was so profound that some of the phenomena, the transition of colours and then to colourlessness, for example, produced in the mystic are identical with those of the Sufi. Hasidism, the mystical piety and practice which arose in Poland in the 18th century, is not only the real continuation of the Kabbalah, but it must be based on Sufism or a part of the Kabbalah, which is identical with it. The same source notes the striking analogy between the practice of the two systems and the many points in common with Sufism of the Hasidist activity, including the relationship of the disciples to the master. The very first book of the ethical writings of the Judeo-Arabian period is on a Sufi model. Hence, Sufism has a special claim upon the attention of Jewish scholars because of its influence on the ethical and mystical writings of the Judeo-Arabian period. It need hardly be added that the words Arabian and Jewish have little meaning to the Sufis, and this is one reason why there was such an entente between the Spaniards who followed the Sufi way and transmitted so much of it to the Christian West. The Kabbalah was, of course, a formulation, a frame for the attainment of certain objectives. Like most other systems, the framework of the Sufi orders is another, of this kind. It lingered on as a husk after the time for its dissolution and readaptation had passed. Magic and miracles, for the Sufi, have a similar active function. They apply for the time and place and other conditions. Since they are both the product of the time and the means of a development, they have to be considered as limited in one respect and continuing in another. While people persist in trying to examine them by other criteria, they will continue to convey a bizarre and useless aspect.